Welcome to this episode of the Biometrics Leadership Lab podcast. I'm Amanda Cross, and my guest today is Mike Inkman. Mike is a clinical data leader with over 20 years of experience across CROs and large and small sponsors. He's also worked with both in-house and outsourced data management models. Now he's focused on developing his knowledge of AI systems, bringing AI together with his real-world experience, enabling quality clinical data based on a focused data strategy and seamless execution by high-performing teams. And today we are talking about his CRO journey to sponsor and what he's learned along the way. And like many of my other guests, Mike's had the privilege of working for CROs that no longer exist. So see if you catch the blast from the past in our discussion today. Michael, welcome, and thanks for joining me.
Hello, thank you for having me again.
So I thought you would be great to talk to because you made the magical jump from CRO to sponsor side, and it'd be great to hear what that was like and what you've learned. But first, you get my question that everybody gets asked to start with, which is how did you get into clinical research in the first place?
Yeah, so like many people, I think our age, my age, it was sort of fell into it, right? I had the right sort of interest and attributes, for the position. I had just graduated with a degree in microbiology. I had just learned that I was a terrible, in lab lab tech. Had done a little bit of sort of if then else programming for replacing Axums, if you know those blood test machines from Abbott, so a recruiter reached out to me just out of the blue, and part of it was the recruiter was smart. She knew what this job was, and part of it was my potential hiring manager at the time was really looking to recruit new people and get new faces into the job. She was, so I'm located here in Illinois. She was an Illinois State University grad. I didn't go there, but she was trying to get that, a program built there around clinical data management. And so she was looking for new grads with the skill sets and things to fill the need. And then my first project, since I was microbio, I was put directly onto the remainder of the HIV trials for ritonavir and then lopinavir, right? And so that's kind of where my major bled into the job. And so that's sort of how I got my start.
Well, what was the first thing you did in data management?
Close out queries for height checks.
Yeah. Because there's never any very short or very tall people.
And determining how many times we should requery vital signs, right? That was
Yeah. So thinking back about all the different roles you've had in data management, which ones do you think had the biggest impact on you?
So I do think the first few probably had the most impact, right? So actually I did start at Abbott Labs back before they were AbbVie, as a contractor. And they, were very strict with the Abbott way back then. They had a very formalized training. In fact, my first week of training there was, September 11th happened.
Oh, gosh.
So, and they just said, well, keep on working. We don't have any information. So, and then we all went home at lunch to find out what. So it was very formalized and very strict single path sort of training. But it was also if you managed to survive a year of just query closeout and query generation, then they put you into a sort of a more holistic training where they showed you from, protocol development through the completion of your TMF, back when it was paper and all, for the data management department. So that fundamentally taught me the rules, right? Now they were very finite and very strict. So when I saw the chance to move over to the CRO Kindle, I took that opportunity and learned that, there isn't just one way to do all these things, right? That was the Abbott interpretation of how to do these things. But so then I tried to find my path in, how much deviating from the Abbott path is, deviating from the guidance, right? Versus how much was just, because they had just had an audit at Abbott back then. So that was a bit of a learning for the next few years. And then I got promoted to a clinical data manager at Kindle. And that's where I first tried out leadership with definitely some wins and losses, right? And then towards the end of that time, Kindle was being bought out by INC. So I didn't want to take my chances with that. And I went out and found a small sponsor who was working on nutritional. And that was another sort of seared in experience because I was building the database from scratch in an Oracle Clinical RDC-like system. And I was the only one, right? I was the only one in the department, only one who had responsibility for anything, right? So, and you can't hide, right, in a little company like that. So those three definitely sort of branded my skills. And then, I think I learned the most from them because they, knew and made the most mistakes there and that sort of thing.
I was just going to say, although this is not very encouraging, but I was going to say that first job where you have real responsibility and you can't hide, and if you haven't made a lot of mistakes at it, you actually haven't learned very much. But
Right.
You can sometimes think back to your first job and just cringe in realizing what you didn't know.
Yeah, and in fact, right after that, I had an interesting experience because I left that job only because they had to take a bridge loan to make the money for the phase 3, and they basically weren't going to have any work for me for 9 months. So I said, all right, I'm going to leave, come back. So I went and consulted for 9 months, and then they did hire me back. And because Chicago tech biopharma is so small, I made friends when I was consulting with my replacement at that job, who then I was replacing afterwards. So we went to lunch together, all of us, on my last day before I took over for her. And I asked her what she thought she would have done differently in the system I had built. And she said nothing. And I said, oh my, well, you don't know my system very well then. Because
that was your
for the
first
last year, I was
wasn't it?
thinking about all the things I would have done differently.
Yeah, nothing points out what you could have changed by a little bit of distance. So I always say working at CRO is very different than working at a sponsor. And so what do you feel that the CRO world taught you that you wouldn't have learned if you would have just gone straight to sponsor?
Yeah, so there's a lot more focus on being flexible, right? Making sure that, say, timelines are hit, and maybe, finding ways, routes that are not against the guidance that still suffice, as opposed to the very rigid structure that you sometimes get at, especially at large pharma. Right. At large pharma, I remember sometimes I had to wait 2.5 weeks to add a new variable because they had to have a meeting to see whether it met their standards and whatnot and wasn't already in the database somewhere with some format, et cetera. Right. None of that sort of thing happens at the CRO. Right. So there's a lot more focus on productivity per hour. Right. You have to put out a certain amount of output or justify basically every hour that you're not working directly on a billable project. Right. And you have a little more flexibility when you're at the sponsor. You can take more time for training or learning about the drug compound you're working on. Right. That sort of thing, which, if you're working 4 to 6 projects at a CRO, you don't have time to do. Right.
Yes, you're reading the protocol so you can log it in the training system.
Right.
You're
Right.
not reading it to truly maybe understand the whole science and what's going on around
Right.
it.
Right.
I worked for GSK when it was G, and a cringe story about myself and my past, but they at one point were putting in time reporting,
Mhm.
and we were just appalled that like we have to say what we're doing. And then you go to a CRO and it's like, what are you doing every 15 minutes? So
Right.
it's really very, very, very different. So what do you think like the realities of working data management in a CRO? And I love this question because you were an actual data manager at the CRO, doing those studies. So what is the reality of leading multiple studies across multiple sponsors?
Much harder to remember everybody who should be like CC'd, everybody who should be included in a conversation, and it's much faster moving, right? So you don't necessarily, as a sponsor, or from the CRO, you get a lot of those emails saying, "Why weren't we included in this?" Right, from the sponsor. And you're like, "Well, things were moving so fast over here. We weren't sure what the decision was. We didn't want to come back to you without a decision, right?" And then they say, "Oh, well, we wanted to be included in that decision," right? And you have that sort of thing, and it's not nearly as black and white as it seems from the sponsor side, because even though sponsors always talk about wanting transparency, and they don't want to hear about every problem without any kind of answer or solution or way to make it work, right? So there's always that sort of balancing act on the CRO side to say, when do we disclose, right? Now, I err on, and because of my experience on both sides, err on telling them a little too early, maybe, as opposed to a little too late. But yeah, I think that's, and I think unfortunately, too much time is spent on CROs in deciding that, right? On when do we disclose?
It's a hard thing. And you brought out 2 points that are really hard. One is, I think sponsors know in their souls, even if they don't want to acknowledge it on a day-to-day basis, any lead is probably working on multiple studies. And but they don't necessarily want to believe that when it comes to getting work done on their project. And that is completely reasonable and expected. And the other thing you brought up is the problem solving. And I've had this conversation in multiple different venues with multiple different people, which is, don't bring the problem without a solution. So you try and wait till you have a solution before you go to the sponsor and say, hey, this is going on. Here's some options. Do you want to walk through them? Do you want us to choose? What does that look like? And then there's I always feel like the more serious problem, like I've dealt with some serious issues. And, in those cases, I think you have to err on the side of immediately saying something. This has happened. These people are working on next steps, but we didn't want to withhold it from you,
Right.
which is a lot different of a situation than a run of the mill problem. Maybe I just pulling something out of the air, but maybe like a scope change conversation is different from a missed database lock conversation.
Right. Or like, I used to work with a guy who worked in blood typing for when they're about to do procedures, right? That's emergency, right? If you have a problem there, you have to tell somebody immediately, right? In data, it's a little ambiguous, right? But then there's the cases where it's obvious that the CRO just didn't want to tell you. Like maybe we had a site in Chile that didn't have proper air conditioning, right? And the product sat out. So that, we want to know right away, because there's nothing we can do for the patient right then, right? And we have to find a solution for that as soon as we can. And it's not so much the CRO, right? Like the CRO identified it, and obviously there'll be some blowback to say, why is the site not following through, right? But really, it's a site that has to get their act together. So that kind of thing is an example of something that I would bring up right away, as opposed to say, we know we have this edit check that's firing too often, right? That's not, you can fix that in the background and not necessarily alert me, right? As opposed to the other way around.
So the experience of working on multiple studies at the same time is unique. It's not unique to a CRO, but having that experience as a person is can be kind of unique. And you learn a lot about yourself, and you learn a lot about how people are managing you, and what you were getting in terms of support. So how did your experience working on multiple studies at a CRO shape your leadership style?
Yes. So originally, I didn't really know any leadership style other than sort of the authoritative, and it doesn't work very well in a CRO, especially now. If you're working with anyone remote or anyone international, right? It's just not a viable way to run things anymore. At the time, it kind of sort of worked, but it was more like round, square peg, round hole.
Mhm.
I would say though that where it really makes a difference though is because you have to divide your time, right? And I think the easiest way to manage that at a CRO is to, even though you have multiple studies and multiple teams, that try to align those teams as much as you can, right? Like I've had it where I had a SAS programmer on 2 of my studies at the same time. If you can get that, it's great, right? Because instead of having one meeting or with 2 different, 2 meetings with 2 different people, you can have one meeting with one person and be much more efficient, right? Especially if it's for the same sponsor and same whatever, then it makes more sense, right? Because they're not having to relearn as much. And I think that's true of your data reviewers as well. If you can align them as much as you can, right? Maybe there's a pool of 12 and you have 5 regulars and the others are add-ons. I think when you can get that to align, it's better. In order to do that though, you have to be sort of proactive, right? Whereas at the sponsor, that doesn't really impact things, right? You don't worry about how many people are on the team. You worry about where they got done, right? So my leadership from the sponsor side is to basically embed myself with the CRO so that they have trust, right? And like, I want them to be able to tell me they made a mistake. And if I'm being too heavy or too, authoritative, they won't share, right? They won't share unless it's already fixed and dusted and done. And so I like to embed myself there. And from that point of view, I also, on the sponsor side, I try to protect my data management team as if they were internal, which, as the internal team, when you're on the CRO side, you kind of do that reflexively, right? They are your team. You are protecting them that way, right? So I try to mirror that on the sponsor side. And I don't know if I ever would have thought of that from an outsourcing model if I'd never done the in-source side of it.
Yes, because what you want is your functional counterpart at a sponsor to be advocating for you and your function, much the same as you would want your line manager to be advocating
Right.
for you internally.
Right.
And having that advocacy internal at the sponsor, someone who can say, listen, it's data management. This stuff happens. It's not they're the worst CRO in the world. It's
Right.
How are we fixing this problem that was going to crop up one way or another because it's clinical research. So I think that's probably very nice. Do you find that your CRO teams, it takes a while to warm up to that, or do you see that they
Yes.
are?
Yeah. So, they've, everybody's been burned before on the CRO side, right? So it definitely takes a little bit before they go, oh, he's engaged, not because he's trying to find everything we do wrong, right? He's engaged because he has, a vested interest, right? A literal vested interest sometimes. Like my stock options might matter for this trial. And maybe I only have 2 trials. So that's my 100% focus, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm meddling or trying to find every error, right? I'm looking for trends and issues within the organization, though. I always tell them I want to help them look good, because then that helps me look good. And then, we don't have any of those very awkward conversations where people are pointing at, each other.
Yeah, it can. I think you probably know this coming from data management more than most people, but it's data management is sometimes, I guess, to use a very American phrase, the redheaded stepchild, on the one that people will complain about and put it on their fault. So having a strong advocate at sponsor side can be really very helpful for them. Do you prefer working with a full service CRO or a specialty data CRO?
Specialty. Yeah. Honestly, I treat the full service CRO as if they're the specialty CRO anyways. Right. So that I'm working, and ClinOps doesn't always love that, right? Because I'm sort of embedding myself, right? And saying, we work our way and we will communicate, we'll always keep you in the copy, but you're not going to make every decision for us, right? Because that's not your role. But we will keep you informed on all the decisions and if it's going to have a big downstream effect, we'll definitely, have a discussion, see how much impact we can, rectify or prevent, right?
I mean, I think I heard you say because they didn't like the acquisition, but at some point you're looking for a new job and you decided to go sponsor side. So
yeah.
What were you thinking about that beforehand, or was it just the first job that you found when you wanted to move on?
So actually, I think it was between two positions at the time. I think I made the right call, but I really like the autonomy, but that doesn't happen, and that's a trick, right? Because if you go to big pharma, how much autonomy do you have? Maybe not much. If you go to CRO, how much autonomy do you have? It very much depends.
Yeah.
Right. So it's so I was looking for a job with autonomy, and this little pharma nutritional company was allowing me to build my infrastructure from scratch. So I got excited about that, and that's made that happen.
So smaller is always better than larger if you're looking for more varied activities and less structure. Right. And I think small sponsor is probably going to give you the most autonomy overall.
That makes sense. Yeah. Right.
So there you are sitting sponsor side. What are you learning your first year? What's the biggest surprise?
So really learning the role, I think, of data management, right? Because I had to create so many things from scratch. Like there was no method for database validation at that company. So I had to work with QA to create one, right? This whole database design checklist, all these pieces. My manager was director of biostats, right? So basically whenever he needed, I had to produce, right? And then if I couldn't produce it directly, we paste it give it to the SAS programmer to reformat it, right? And then I got much more involved in safety as well, because I built the database. I had to very much interact with pharmacovigilance and safety a lot more, right? So it wasn't this separate siloed department. It was my coworker here. Yeah. Right. So this all helped later when they decided they needed an enterprise system, a new enterprise system, right? And then I knew how to go about deciding who had the stakes in the new system, how to pick out a new system, IT requirement, like that whole process of IT requirement piece. I learned all that there because it was the 6-7 people sitting around me, right? Working that all out.
Another benefit of small companies, you're really going to learn a lot more about what other functions are doing a lot faster at a
Yes.
small
Yes.
company. If if you like things structured and organized and processes built and in place, a small company is not for you.
Right.
If you want to learn as much as you can as fast as you can, a small company is 100% on either side, I think, of the table. So now you're sitting sponsor side and you're working with your first CRO. How do you view your CRO? Does it change?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because then you start hearing that stale joke. Who's the worst CRO you ever worked with? The last one, you know.
Yeah.
uh, right, and there's that sort of attitude with that, right? And uh, and if you work both sides, you're kind of like, wait a minute, that's not really what it is, right? There are definitely, because there's this feeling that people who work at a CRO, they're sort of, or at least project managers, are kind of BS masters, right? Um, uh, that uh, that yes, they're being pulled in too many directions, but also they're unfocused, right? But um, and sometimes it's true, right? Because how many 0.05 projects can you do?
Yeah. At least 3.
Right. So there's some of that, and some of that's true just because of the structure of the CRO, right? It depends how hard you're being pulled in different ways. But yeah, I started to take that a little personally, saying like, well, certainly when I was on that side, I wasn't BSing anybody. I was trying to get things done, right? It might have felt like, you know, like we weren't given the full truth, but maybe that's because we were just digging into things, right? Or whatever.
I was having this conversation over the weekend with someone about speaking CRO. My view is nobody's going to be better on oversight of a CRO than someone who has worked at a CRO. It doesn't matter how many CROs you've overseen. If you've never worked at one, it hits a little different because they speak their own language and there's just certain ways to talk about things. And if you've worked at a CRO, if you are getting that runaround response or if they're actually using words that would trigger the solutions being put in place. And so
Right.
I think you probably had that advantage going for you when you went sponsor side. But what do you think?
And that was a real learning curve for me too when I was at the CRO put into the data management, right? Because no one trains you on that speak.
Yeah.
Right. You just pick it up like, oh, that was too harsh of a response. I should not have been that forthcoming. Oh, they clearly think I'm holding back. Okay, what should I say, right? So it's one of those things that you learn after a couple of years of being embedded in that position and company, maybe.
Yeah, and every company has its own, maybe I would say, internal norms around how you say things and how you respond to things, and then you just learn your own style. But it is really interesting, and I think if you're newer in your career, especially CRO side, pay attention to how those with more tenure and experience are speaking to sponsors and how they are speaking about problems and how they are disclosing information. I don't think anybody's intending to hide information. It's just how you frame it and how you work with the sponsor on whatever it is you're sharing. I think it's a real opportunity to learn from some other experienced people, and it's not throwing it all out there in a really direct way is almost never the right way. And
Right.
so
Right.
what is really the right way? But then that goes back to when you're sponsor side, if you haven't worked at a CRO, you might not catch how they're framing things and which way is meaningful and what isn't. But the flip side of that is, what do you think CROs underestimate about sponsor pressure?
Yeah. So, there is this perception that that money is a fountain, right? Like almost, right? Like they can just pour more in. You can just keep adding to that scope. Scope creep's not going to be a real problem for them, right? And the truth is, it really depends how fast that creep happens, right? If you're doubling the scope of a project, it's going to be a big problem for anybody, right? If you're doubling the startup costs, that's going to be a huge problem. But if you try to, so I always emphasize efficiency, and I don't think CROs, I think they're coming around to it now, but I don't think there was a real focus on efficiency, and that is a real focus on sponsor side. So like, I mean, this was several years ago now, but like 8 years ago, I worked at PPD, and because it was cheaper, they would just have people look over the massive listings of data and compare them, like med versus AE, right? Just like they did in the 80s, right? Because they could outsource it and it was cheap. Now I think they brought in AI and made some improvements, but basically because it was unsustainable, right? You can't do it faster that way. You can only do it cheaper that way. Yeah. And so the constraint from sponsors is always time, and CROs do see that part. Money, and CROs sort of see that part. It depends, right? Sometimes they want more money, sometimes they're conscious of it. Depends on your PM and things. And then the third part is resourcing, right? Sponsors nowadays are pretty lean, so we don't have extra people to do extra things. So we have to figure out how we are going to manage that and keep the scope reasonable. Oh, and one last thing too is focus on certain quality, right? CROs are usually pretty good about getting things done on time. But like we used to joke forever ago that our CRO at Kendall, management cared much more about whether it was on time, whether it was done well. Yeah. As long as it barely passed QC, that was okay with them, right? That's from a sponsor data management point of view. Like, I've had heat on me for having one kit number incorrect in a database of thousands, because that kit number wasn't the one that was actually distributed, right? Now, the heat came off a little bit because we had queried twice. And there wasn't much else we could do, right? The CRA didn't do their source data verification, right? But if I hadn't checked that field, right, that bit, I would have been in trouble for that, right? And nobody at the CRO is going to that sort of detail, right? Because you don't have time to do field by field review, double check it all, triple check it all. Because in this case, it made placebo look better. Oh. So it changed our p-value slightly.
It's not ideal.
Right. So
which is the other constraint, I think, that is easy to lose sight of in a CRO with all the time pressure, is what this study means to a sponsor, right? I think any sponsor, no matter the size, a study is important because, you know, there's millions and millions and millions of dollars moving through a clinical research study. A small sponsor, a biotech with only one or two viable candidates running their first study, maybe this is everything to them. And I think there's a lot of internal pressure from the board and the C-suite that people are under in terms of understanding where the data is and how this clinical trial is progressing. And, you know, it's easy to lose sight of that on the CRO side, but knowing that can really help you navigate the relationship with the sponsor a little bit better.
Yeah. And I try to, you know, when I say I embed myself with the team, I try to integrate that when I realize that it's not clear. Right. So I try to point out, like, I'm not going over these kit numbers because I love going over kit numbers, right? It's not like part of my job requirement or anything, right? It's because if these kit numbers aren't right, I'm misrepresenting a p-value, right? That's a big deal. And, you know, like I try to frame it in a way that people relate to, right? Like there was some misdosing on a trial I worked on recently. And they're like, it was, 10% off. It's almost the range of allowance of error, right? Just slightly over. And I was like, all right, that's fine. But think about it this way. If this was your grandmother taking an experimental med and they got 10% too much dosage in an IV, how acceptable is that to you, right?
Well, and there's that real practical level that you just mentioned, and there's also a lot of other implications. It could impact the safety profile. It could impact the efficacy profile. And if one patient has this problem and it's caught and everybody moves on, that's one thing. Right. But if the study standard is, 11% over is perfectly fine. You didn't really dose at your dose level, did you? And
right.
How is that caught, and who's managing that?
Right. Like and another one was it was supposed to be an infusion for an hour. Some patients got impatient, give or take 10 minutes. Some got impatient, and so they dosed them in a half hour. I'm like, is that okay? Right? Like, I think in our particular med, because it had a very, very safe profile, right? It didn't end up causing a problem, but that was just sort of an assumption by the investigators that it's got a safe profile. We can speed this up, right? Like, yeah. So
but who's catching that, right? And right. we haven't touched on this because this isn't really the focus of this conversation, but it is as trials are evolving and as roles are evolving, who's monitoring stuff like that,
right?
And who's what is data management monitoring? What is an in-house monitor monitoring? What is a risk manager monitoring? What is a central monitor noticing trends across the sites? And that's a high risk issue, the dosing. And so who's responsible for that? And it's
right.
I think everybody is ultimately right. For noticing something's going on, but how it gets resolved and what happens when you bubble it up, I think.
Yeah, and that's really one of those things too. That's a little, it's certainly tricky with the in-house monitoring, which in theory I'm very much in favor for. Right, it's kind of what data management's done all along, in a way, right? Like we've always been removed from the site and doing our review and trying to keep it clean. But if it's treated as, it's just that one outlier and not as a potential safety thing, right? Check with the safety team, check with whatever, right? Your medical monitor. Or the opposite. Well, so many sites are doing it that we don't really care. right. Like it's almost normal. No, like that's not what the protocol says. So that's, you're saying that it's almost normal to have a protocol deviation. Right. That's not ideal, right?
We can take a hard left here and and talk about this. For me, it's so interesting because if you're in data management and you're seeing a trend, yes, you should funnel it up. Also, though, you might think, well, 50% of our patients are coming through with this. Certainly the monitors are deeming this acceptable. And certainly, from a protocol deviation standpoint, this is deemed acceptable. So, if you're at the trail end of data coming in-house,
right?
Maybe you might not. So you should, if anybody's listening, you should surface something like that in writing so that somebody can tell you it's not a problem. But I mean, so you do have a responsibility. It's also easy to just say, well, 50% of our patients came through with this. It's if everybody's responsible, how does it really bubble up? So I think as a data manager, if you're seeing something, bubble it up. Which all of that has just interesting and nothing to do with this. But I think that,
I do think that's sort of an example. And I went off topic a bit, but it's sort of an example of how the sponsor DM works differently than the CRO DM, right? Because the CRO DM, that probably wasn't scoped, right?
Yeah.
And therefore they're not really looking at it, and they're not going to escalate it, maybe, right? And it should have been dealt with upstream for certain. Right. So then when I come in and look at data, I'm always telling them, I'm not looking at the same thing that you do. I assume you're doing your job. I'm looking at different trends and different things.
And such a good point. I mean, from the basic, it's not in scope. I mean, there's scope that's going to say we're going to do 5 listing reviews and these cross domain checks, and that's what you do, and you scope that with the sponsor, and that's what you're checking for. And if something's not on that list, then yes, a CRO data manager is probably not going to see it. And it may be important. So I think that's a great distinction between what a sponsor DM might be looking for and looking into. And I think that's
I think it's also a very big distinction between sponsor and CRO, because sponsor has so many rules usually, right, that they're following, that they assume that those rules apply to the CRO. And in some cases, some of the big companies, Pfizer, for example, right, will force them to do their SOPs. But a lot of times they're just an assumption that SOP A at pharma company will match or correlate so closely with the CRO, and it might not, right? So then I'm always trying to gauge the separation between our SOP, their SOP, and then fill in what gaps do we have, right?
And this is an important component of sponsor oversight of CROs. And if you are a sponsor and you don't have data management expertise sitting in-house or consulting for you, these are the types of things that you might be missing. And this is why it can be important. Not why it could be. This is why it is important to have data internally or get a consultant to look at it, because it's all these little bits about the day in and day out of data management that you think might be happening and should be, but really a CRO data management team is working according to scope.
Yes.
Not according to finding everything in your project.
And ultimately the sponsor is responsible. So if it wasn't scoped, the CRO really isn't, they're not going to get slapped for that, right? Because it wasn't in scope.
Yeah. And that's a huge component of, E6 is the sponsor oversight, and how are you providing for that? And I think you gave some really, really good examples. If you could go back to Kendall and see Mike working very early in his career, what advice would you give to yourself?
I would tell myself not to make it so personal, right? Part of the plus and minus with working with me is I get very, very involved and very so I'm sort of high energy that way, right? But a drug failing doesn't mean I've failed, right? A project going sideways is not necessarily my fault, right? So that piece, I think also to be, I would have definitely told myself to chill and be a little less forthright. I'm very known for being honest, but certainly when I was younger, not known as much for my discretion.
If you knew 20 years ago you were still going to be doing this, what do you wish somebody had told you?
Oh boy, yeah. I certainly wish somebody had told me that paper was basically going obsolete, soon, right? Like I started 2001, right? There was already pilot projects at Pfizer, right, doing EDC. There was already EMR systems at certain doctors' offices. So I would have liked to have been trained up on that earlier, instead of waiting for it to come around to the CRO and and be trained with everybody else, right? I would have liked to have been ahead of that curve. I would have liked to have had more experience budgeting before I suddenly started budgeting. Same thing with resource management, right? It's one thing to say this person's going to be a 0.3. It's another thing to have them work a 0.3. It's I would have definitely gone and said, look at different sorts of management styles, right? I didn't have a MBA, and most of the people who came in with MBAs and didn't know anything about biology or clinical trials were not great bosses, but they did have a different managerial style.
It's really funny you talk about the paper. I always say I have two very distinct parts of my career, and I had a very lengthy break because of the challenges with raising our children. But when I left, people were talking about CDISC, because you mentioned CDASH earlier. You know, it used to be, do you want this to be run on CDASH standards or your own?
Right.
I mean, so people were talking about that. They were talking about CDISC. At the time, when I stopped working, I was actually working for an EDC company, but, you know, EDC was still kind of novel.
Yeah.
And I stopped working, and I came back to work, and it's all EDC. CDISC is everywhere. And so you're many years in, like some of us are. And, you know, when you look at your career today, what still excites you about clinical trials and data management?
So I like, I still like the science, right? That's what drew me in the first place. And that's part of why I never moved to some other departments, right? Because I like learning what's the new curious, endpoint, right? What's the gold standard of that? How does this disease progression, how do they think it works, right? How does the drug work? So all that sort of science stuff that brought me into biology major in the first place. So that's still all interesting to me. I also do think, I think there's going to be pretty radical changes on the preclinical side with AI and things and recruitment, right? So I'm hoping that clinical trials get a little cheaper, right, per patient acquisitions. And I like to think that AI won't really be, it's sort of like EDC for data management, I think, in that it didn't replace us at all, right? Instead, it kind of gave us more to do, right? Because we were more efficient. So we could work on more things than we could when it was just paper, right? Because you didn't need 35 reviewers anymore. But as a data manager managing the team, you work with less reviewers, but you had just as much work to do as before.
Yeah, well, here's to 20 more years, because if you haven't done your 40 years, you're not getting out. But here's to 20 more years of data management and the next stage of your career. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I always love talking to you.
Thank you.